Rightio, good evening everyone and welcome to tonight's MLA Productivity and Profitability webinar. My name is Hilary and I am the webinar coordinator from Aggregate Consulting this evening. Tonight we're joined by Associate Professor Forbes Brian of the University of Adelaide, investigating flock rebuild strategies as a recent MLA project. Just a bit of housekeeping for those who haven't joined us before. This is the control panel that will be at the top right corner of your screen. The red arrow button on the left collapses and reinstates the control panel if you want to get a better look at your slides. You should be able to hear us, but we cannot hear you. So as Forbes goes through his presentation this evening, please type your questions in the box provided. I will relay them to Forbes at the end of the webinar. Please make your questions as succinct as possible. I'll also note these webinars are recorded and are available on the MLA website, usually by Friday, but if not, early next week. So just to introduce our speaker this evening, Dr. Forbes Brian, who's an Associate Professor at the School of Animal and Veterinary Sciences at the University of Adelaide. Forbes works at the Davies Livestock Research Centre and the University of Adelaide, based at Roseworthy in South Australia. He grew up on a family farm and has owned and managed 650-hectare grazing property near Nareen, Victoria. Forbes has specialised training in genetics and reproductive physiology, working in industry development, research and management roles for state government agencies before joining the University of Adelaide. With projects in livestock genetics, reproduction and wool harvesting, Forbes has special interests in the genetics of lamb survival and fly strike, amongst others, including the management of livestock production enterprises. So thank you very much for joining us this evening, Forbes. I will make you the presenter now. It should pop up.
Thanks, Hilary. I hope you can see my screen.
Yep.
So good evening, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to discuss this flock rebuilding project investigation. Just by way of background, this work was tendered basically in 2020, and we put together a team from the University of Adelaide and Pinion Advisory, which used to be formerly known as Rural Directions. So I have from the university Darren Koopman and Stephen Lee and Royce Pitchford and Simon Voigt from Pinion Advisory as part of the team. Also, and I'll explain a bit further on, we set up a producer reference group to view our work and test our assumptions, and we're also using an independent reviewer from Victoria. So just as background, basically the Australian sheep industry, which many of you may have seen something like this chart before, but the message would be nothing that would surprise you. From the peak of around 1989, 1990, when the wool price scheme came to an end, we've had a fairly rapid erosion of sheep numbers, and probably also not quite at the same rate of erosion in the breeding ewe numbers of the Australian sheep industry. At the same time, though, we've actually gone up in the lamb kill pretty consistently, actually, with some variation until about 2019, 2020. Obviously, the droughts had an impact there, but I'm sure that the numbers will creep back up again now that better conditions are upon us, which I hope most of you are experiencing. So that's the background. So, I mean, basically, quite obviously that the drivers for increasing flock numbers and reproduction rates are very strong at the moment. Low numbers, high sheep and lamb prices, and the reward for investment and effort in getting more lambs out of your ewe flock has rarely been higher. In fact, I'd probably change that to say has never been higher. So with that background, I mean, the aims of this project is really to generate material to inform producers' strategies for flock rebuilding, and to make the information that was produced regionally relevant and to span various enterprise and flock types and different flock age profiles. So the objectives, basically we aim to develop the various flock building scenarios and track the inventory of the flock, the cash flow, the profit and loss situation and overall balance sheet of stock numbers and profit and loss over a period of 5 years forward into the future. We've modelled impact of variation in feed costs, differences in stock prices and flock structures. We've also looked at the variation in benefit costs across production zones, enterprise types and flock age profiles. We've basically developed somewhat theoretical case studies. We couldn't really find actual case studies for every different flock rebuilding strategy. And we've identified and reported on some intangible barriers to flock rebuilding, and I've present some of those towards the end. I really call them challenges to flock rebuilding rather than totally barriers. And we're also developing some producer information resources, and we'll go into that as we get to them. Spend a little bit of time just on talking about the methods and the assumptions, so that if anyone's wondering how we came up with the figures, we have some idea from what I'm saying now. But there's obviously a lot of detail when I'll just try to summarise it as well as I can. So the project tender specified most of the flock rebuild strategies that we were to examine. However, we also consulted and used expertise in the project team to refine that list and added to in some cases. And we've used the results of research and field trials, including on-farm trials if they were available and we could get hold of the information, to really refine that listing. The next step was really the creation of a number of spreadsheet models, and Royce Pitchford was the person who did a lot of that spreadsheet modelling. The idea was to represent as many of the flock types as we could think of that exist in Australia. There may be some really odd ones that we didn't model, but we ended up with 9 in all. I'll show you a list in a moment. And we've used benchmarking data and trial data to make production assumptions. And we've tested those assumptions with that producer reference group I referred to before and the independent reviewer. And at the moment, we're right at the point we've submitted a draft final report. We've had the independent reviewer come back with comments. We're going to meet in about a week or so to finalise the final report and the product. So it's probably a good time to talk about the project because it's pretty well done, but I'm very keen if someone's got some questions or comments, we can utilise that as part of the project write-up as well. And obviously at the end, we've produced results and examined the sensitivity to feed cost, stock prices, etc. So the flock rebuild strategies, there are basically, I've listed 9 main ones, but there's sort of sub-strategies within those. So just in summary, the first strategy there is a pretty simple one, which according to MLA and AWI surveys is one that a lot of people are using, which is to retain more ewes. The first and probably the most common is to retain an older age group of ewes for either 1 or 2 years longer, or retain a higher proportion of hoggets, in other words, culling less. The second way, pretty obviously, is to purchase in more ewes, and that can be done either purchasing young ewes usually as ewe lambs, or probably more likely hogget ewes, or older ewes, often at the 5.5-year-old age as calf age ewes, and take them on for another year or two. The third category is what I'd call really increasing fertility and fecundity. And I guess that really could be described as increasing the reproductive potential of the sheep. So a lot of it is around things like feeding pre-joining, particularly energy supplements to increase condition score. And then classic flushing with lupins. That's trying to get a real flush of feed into them just at joining time. Ovi-stim vaccination, we'll talk a bit more about that later on. The fourth category is really increasing survival of twin lambs. Based on a lot of research and survey work, really the biggest issue with lamb survival is for twin lambs and multiples. Mating new lambs was also considered, as was rejoining dry ewes, and that's rejoining within a season, within a breeding season. So more or less, once the information's available at scanning time, then quickly rejoining the animals that are dry. We also were asked to look at increasing merino by merino matings, pure merino matings, and we also considered accelerated lambing systems, and there are two types which I'll describe a bit later. And then the final one was a bit out there, was to use sex semen produce a higher proportion of female progeny, and I'll explain what's involved there as we go through. There were a few others that we actually considered. In particular, I don't know whether anyone's familiar with the work that was done at Charles Sturt University on feeding omega fatty acids to try to manipulate the number of females born from ewes. I guess in looking at the papers and looking at the consistency of results, we just didn't feel it was consistent enough to run the economic analysis. But there's also a range of other strategies that we could have looked at as well, which was short-term feeding of green versus dry pasture, including lucerne, use of a different product like Regulin implants, which are classically used with a spring, early summer mating to boost the number of lambs born and conception rates. And finally, not finally, but it's been suggested to us we should have considered change to a later lambing time. I guess I'll push back on that one a little bit, because that's quite a difficult thing to look at, because usually a change of lambing time is associated with an awful lot of other managerial changes in pasture utilisation, on and on it goes. So it's quite a complicated one to look at. Genetic improvement, which we considered to be a bit too slow for the purpose of the exercise, and use of high fertility sheep like Baroola Merinos. Again, we considered that to be, although you can get F1 crosses on the ground in a year or two, if we're looking at a 5-year projection, it's not going to contribute a huge amount to flock rebuilding in that short of time. So we've ended up with the list we have. So the flock enterprises we considered, we started out looking at two main ones. First, there's self-replacing dual-purpose merino, and then a self-replacing maternal flock. And I'll talk about those results in the next few slides. But we also looked at a merino by terminal sire situation, merinos by Border Leicester sires, F1U, which is classically a Border Leicester merino ewe by terminal sire to produce second cross lambs, a self-replacing clean skin operation, both in the agricultural areas and rangeland, a merino wool-focused type property with obviously probably slightly lower reproduction rates, but concentrating on finer wool, or you know, more wool focused, and then merinos in the rangeland. So just talking about the dual purpose merinos and self-placing maternals for the time being. What I've done here is I've tried as much as possible to, rather than put a lot of figures on a table, to present things in the histogram. So hopefully you can get the idea which ones are profitable and which ones aren't in a glance. So what I've done is I've coded the top 6 strategies in blue, and then anything that doesn't quite break even or is a long way from breaking even is coloured in pink, with the remainder not coloured in. Okay, so and I might just flip backwards and forwards from this slide, but basically the key results here, firstly this thing called NPV over DSE, that's net present value over dry sheep equivalents. So it's an indication of the total benefits minus the costs discounted back to the current time, divided by the number of animals that you're getting that improvement in. So it's trying to compare apples with apples. So the key results really are that remating once dry ewes, retaining older ewes, lifting twin lamb survival are the top 3 profitable strategies. And then next you've got things like purchasing young or older ewes, ovi-stim vaccination, and mating ewe lambs, the next highest. In fact, that should be 4 strategies there. The only thing is that we also need to consider how quickly these strategies contribute to rebuilding numbers, and I've got some information on that later on. So it's a case of how profitable is it per animal, and then how quickly can you contribute numbers on the ground to build the flock back up to the stocking rate you want. And then finally, just there, a comment about sex semen. Basically, it's used to produce mainly female progeny, but it's actually quite unprofitable. And the reason for that is you've actually got to AI in a commercial flock setting to use sex semen, so the cost structure just becomes prohibitive. It's probably more likely to be profitable in a stud situation with higher animal prices and with AI, an AI program already perhaps underway, and so the additional cost is just the additional cost of the sex or the sorted semen, and has a better chance of being profitable there. So let's just flip now to self-replacing maternals, and same pattern of results, but basically a few slight differences. And if I can summarize again, so I'll just flip forward to this one. So remating once dry ewes and immediately once scanning's finished, and lifting twin lamb survival and ovi-stim vaccination, the top 3. Retaining older ewes, mating ewe lambs, and flushing with lupins are the next highest 3. Increasing condition score of ewes before joining is certainly more worthwhile with the higher lamb survival in maternals versus merinos, and that might be classically, say, with barley. Again, sex semen is a good way to lose money in a commercial flock setting. So back to our list of flock enterprise types and zones. These next slides, 2 slides, really cover these merino cross situations and Border Leicester merino by terminal size second cross lamb systems. And the reason we've done this on a benefit cost basis is it's actually quite difficult to generate a net present value figure. So an alternative way of considering it is just looking at the benefits over the costs. So, and again, the results here, basically the results and the appropriate flock rebuilding strategies here are mainly around retaining older ewes, buying young ewes, buying old ewes, and rejoining dry ewes. And all those strategies are above break even, which is that dotted line in red. And you can see that things like retaining old ewes, there's quite an extra benefit, like it's about 40% above the cost to retain old ewes in a merino terminal situation. The problem is, of course, that in these situations you have a less opportunity to generate replacements. So, for instance, I'll just flip to the next slide. So these other flock types, other flock building options such as boosting fecundity, or the number of lambs born or litter size is another way of describing that. They actually do not contribute to more replacement ewes for that specific farm using the technique, because usually those animals are sold off. But it's going to benefit someone because those extra progeny could be used. For instance, the merino by board Leicester ewe that could be produced can be sold off to another producer who can then help rebuild their flock. So just to look at these last three major flock types, I haven't actually presented detailed results on those because the results are actually broadly similar to self-replacing merinos in the case of the merino wool focus, the merino rangeland animals. If anything, the merino rangeland, there's slightly less profitability for some of the flock rebuilding strategies because usually the reproduction is not quite as good, although some would argue that it is. But the clean skins are quite comparable with the maternal self-replacing flock in terms of strategies. So I said before that it's not just about whether per animal a strategy is profitable, it's also how much that strategy can basically help to quickly rebuild the flock. And if you think of a flock that was perhaps at the end of a drought situation, somewhere around 25% or so understocked, you can see here these strategies on the left, retaining older ewes, buying new hoggets, buying aged ewes, and joining ewe lambs in particular, even retaining more young ewes. In the fifth year, particularly these ones, you're getting back towards something like a 25% increase in dry sheep equivalents. And if you were to retain older ewes and continue doing it, you could actually build back there quite quickly. Some of these strategies, we've only considered doing it for, say, 1 or 2 years. So we can probably look at 100 different ways of actually rebuilding the flock. But these basically are the strategies that can get you there reasonably quickly. Whereas issues around, not issues, but strategies around building or increasing fecundity, the number, litter size or lambs born, as it were, these ones, are actually quite slow at rebuilding. And I'll just flip to that. Yeah, no, I haven't got that. Yeah, so basically they're still profitable, but it just takes longer. The numbers take longer to flow through. So just turning to the next points then, just in terms of, well, how robust are our results in the face of changes in things like supplementary feeding costs, increases or decreases in stock prices, and differences in flock structure? Well, firstly, if we were to change the cost of supplementary feed either up by 23% or down by 23%, the higher costs reduce profit. That's probably pretty obvious. But the top 6 strategies for dual purpose merinos are still profitable, And it's a similar situation with self-replacing maternals. And if you like, that would also be the case with clean skins, and to some extent with the other merino types, merino wool focus, and merinos in the rangeland. The effect on the rank is obviously nothing or very little. If we change stock prices up and down by 20%, and one can always say, well, look at the crazy prices that people are getting now. We can't really model each and every situation on an ongoing basis, but we decided to pick some pretty high prices and then vary that by 20% up and down. And with an increase in stock price, most strategies become more profitable, and vice versa. If the stock prices go down, the profitability of the strategy goes down. Fortunately for us, the top 6 strategies change very little in rank, and they're still profitable. It's just they're less so. With flock structure, we decided to take a look at, particularly for a dual purpose merino, rather than having 4 age groups of ewes, having 6 age groups of ewes. And so in other words, the final lambs being produced when the ewe is 7+ years of age, 7.5 years of age. That gives the opportunity for people to buy in 5.5-year-old ewes, and that turns out to be a bit more profitable in that circumstance. But again, the overall strategies, the rank didn't change that much at all. And when I say we haven't considered the self-replacing maternal one, in fact, the results were fairly similar, but we just haven't put it up on the list. Okay, so the other sensitivity we decided to look at, and this was something we added just the other day for this webinar, we thought it'd be interesting to look at what happens if we change the assumption on twin survival of lambs. And we looked at 2 scenarios, one a fairly low figure there of 60% lambs weaned of twins born, and the other one at 75%. Our base assumption is somewhere in the middle, about 70%. And interestingly enough, the strategies that really change a lot are those that we're boosting fecundity. So in other words, the reproductive potential. So flushing with lupins, increasing condition score pre-joining, probably with something like barley, and use of ovistim vaccination. These things become quite a bit more profitable if you can get your lamb survival up to good levels. And that's just saying that's just writing out what I've just said, basically there. So just moving on a little bit, challenges to rebuilding, and these have in some respects been called barriers to flock rebuilding. But I just thought I'd break them up into 3 basic groups. So the strategies where you're using homebred ewes or purchasing more, so in other words, pretty simple strategies. Retaining older ewes, clearly that avoids the situation of biosecurity risks of purchasing in stock, and lowers cash flow only temporarily because you're foregoing the sale for a year or 2 of some of the castrate ewes, keeping them a little bit longer, but eventually, of course, those are sold and the cash flow tends to come back again. Purchasing ewes, clearly there's risk, but the risk of biosecurity can be reduced if we can buy from a known source. We can't reduce the risk to nothing, obviously, and strictly adhere to a biosecurity plan. In the category of flock rebuilding strategies, improving fertility and lamb survival, so in other words, trying to reduce the wastage factor, like less non-pregnant ewes and more lambs that are born surviving. We can rejoin ewes scanned dry, that have been scanned dry, and improve twin survival. Those strategies are quite low risk, they're profitable, and they do not negatively impact cash flow. However, you really do need to pregnancy scan and scan preferentially for litter size in that situation, or fetal numbers. So if you're not doing that already, that's something that a cost that you would need to consider as part of the budget. Sorry. So the final category is their increasing reproductive potential, or increasing fecundity, litter size, number of lambs born hitting the ground, whatever way you want to describe it. My general feeling is these results are often more variable, and more managerial input is needed to ensure good survival rates and performance. And my recommendation is that only consider those strategies if the recommendation around condition score it and joining, and particularly by lambing, can be met. And that's used in condition score 1 if they've got singles, and 3.2 if they've got twins, and preferably even a bit more than that for maternals. There's the latest findings. That's then to achieve, on average, around 70% twin lamb survival and about 90% in singles as the benchmark. But there's no reason why you couldn't aim higher than that. But that's a good benchmark to reach. And then I've tried to distill all that into some what I'd consider take-home messages. We've calculated results on typical performance, from benchmarking individual flock data we've got hold of. But individual flocks will vary, not only between different farms, but across regions and so on. So you really need to consider the individual situation, to take this sort of general finding, take it on board. I would certainly advise to look at your own numbers before doing anything. The most differences between flock types is really changes in lambing percentage and lamb survival. So clearly, higher lambing percentage makes joining new lambs a lot more attractive. Improving twin lamb survival makes increasing fecundity or litter size or lambs born more attractive as well. And the sort of moral of the story is really get lamb survival right first, or lamb survival rates right first, before considering increasing fecundity. So just to finish off with then some producer information resources we're producing from the project. Firstly, fact sheets. We're aiming those at each of the different flock types. We're intent on doing some podcasts. We've toyed with the idea of producing a spreadsheet model that can be used generally. The experience in the past is that people put a lot of money into these things and they don't get used that much. So I guess that's a bit of a decision in discussion with MLA as to whether they're prepared to put the dollars in there, but you want to be sure that people really feel as though they have a need for it, and whether it's something that would be of interest, and your comments would be interesting there. And then finally, MLA have passed this on to me. So next steps. So information's available and links on the website with the webinar recording. So making more from sheep resources, lifetime ewe management course, and profitable grazing management courses. That's including lifting lamb survival and improving ewe performance. So I might leave it there, Hilary, and invite questions, comments.
Great, thanks so much for that, Forbes. A great oversight into the project so far, and it'll be good to see some of those resources come out of it as we move into rebuilding the flock in Australia. So thanks everyone for listening. If you do have any questions, please send them in now. I will relay them to Forbes in a second. If you do have to head off early, you will be presented with a like a survey as you exit the webinar. This survey takes 2 to 3 minutes and just is feedback for MLA, us as the facilitators and Forbes as the presenter, to make sure the topic was relevant to you this evening, and get any other suggestions for future webinars from you. Again, these webinars are recorded and will be available on the MLA website. If you just Google MLA productivity and profitability webinars, you should be directed right there. So if you're ready for some questions, Forbes, the first one, wouldn't net present value per DSE account for the time taken to rebuild the flock through the discount rate?
The answer is yes. We've actually rejigging the or adding to the final report that basically just present net present values without dividing through by DSEs may be a better way of describing both the profitability and also the build up without having to describe two different factors. But I think in the end we'll just describe it in a number of ways so basically the message can be well communicated. But yeah, thanks for that comment. That's very similar to a comment the reviewer made.
Thank you for that question. The next one, what is the difference between retaining more young ewes and joining lambs?
Yeah, so retaining more young ewes is basically, classically, just putting ewe lamb joinings aside for the moment. Classically, what quite a few producers have done over the years is they've done a culling somewhere between, basically a year old up to 16 months of old before ewes go back into the breeding flock. And a typical culling might be, say, 30% of the flock or 25%, depending on the reproduction rate. We looked at what would happen if you were to back off that culling rate to some extent. We included in that some assumptions around decline in the overall productivity of those animals compared to the average. So that's the retain more young ewe one. The mating ewe lambs is really mating in their first breeding season, so not classically at 18 months of age, but more like probably at an earliest time would be about 7 months of age up to probably about 10 or 11 months of age. And quite a lot of people are doing that at the moment, but it's probably the most fickle part of livestock management. Be interested in any comments people have, but if people do it well, they can get some really good results, but there's a lot of variation in results. That's probably the best way of saying it.
Yeah, thank you for that question. The next one, we have found rejoining dry scan ewes to be very unsuccessful in maternal composites that are strong seasonal breeders. Did you look at that impact?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, because this is an area where there is very little classic research data and not much available on extensive studies on farms. So the information we had was from long-term studies where dry ewes were remated to an annual mating, not within a breeding season. So that within the project, we've flagged that as an area that's really a research gap, and through benchmarking, we could in fact try to get much better information on that and tighten up the recommendation. And I've had some interesting discussions with a few producers about that. You get people, from one end who want to cull animals on one reproductive event or failure to reproduce on one event, to others who swear by it. So yeah, we need more information.
Thank you. The next question is sort of similar. For how many years do you recommend joining dry ewes? At what point does this negatively select for reduced flock fertility?
Yeah, well, probably make a distinction between a commercial flock scenario and a stud situation. So we're talking here about commercial flock situations, not where people are breeding rams from ewes. Although there will be some obviously small effect on the genetics of the flock, but it's mainly going to be current flock effects. Yeah, we only looked at this over a period of 5 years, so I guess we didn't classically look at it, say, for repeating this for periods of, say, 5 to 10 years. So it's a bit hard to answer the question because we didn't do the work. But certainly when it's done a couple of times, I wouldn't expect to see any real decrease. But the assumption might be of interest to people in that from the long-term studies we've done, the typical performance of a non-pregnant ewe that's missed out on getting pregnant on one joining, and then you repeat mate those animals for their lifetime, they're only about 8 to 10% behind the average of the flock. Now that might surprise a few people, but we've actually taken those animals on for up to, say, 4 or 5 joinings afterwards, and that's the figures. As I say, different scenario when they're being remated in the one breeding season, and we just don't have that data.
Thank you. What were the assumptions of dry rates and ewe mortality rates with age? Apologies, I missed the first 10 minutes if this was already presented.
Yeah, no, I didn't go into that level of detail, so it's a good question. Well, just the last one first. The typical rates of mortality that were assumed as animals age, I think we started off at around, at sort of productive ages of 2 and 3 years old. We're talking about, so in the sort of range of 2.5% or thereabouts to 3%. But once an animal is up around 6 or 7 or 8 years old, it sort of certainly goes up to around 7, 8%. Without going back to the spreadsheets and looking, I'm sorry if I'm talking out of my hat, but that's about the level, and we can certainly provide further information on that. With respect to dry ewes, and this caused quite a lot of debate actually, the first figures we used were too low in my view. Dry rates about 3%. We've actually revised that now upwards, and we're talking about dry rates of around 6 to 7%. Probably slightly lower in maternals than merinos, but around those rates.
Thank you.
Just out of interest, there is a study going on at the moment of some pregnancy scanning data from South Australia and New South Wales on about 5 million ewes, and the suggestion is that the dry rates of animals is quite a bit higher than people think, but more analysis has got to be done. But that's a little bit concerning actually. But what we don't know is what percentage of those animals were just being scanned to be sold, what ages they were, and so on. So I wouldn't take that as definite at this stage, but it's certainly an interesting finding that needs further work.
Yeah, I just actually had a note come in. The latest Merino Lifetime Productivity Project newsletter, which is titled Non-Lambing Ewes to Cull or Nut to Cull, looks at some data to date on culling strategies, and it seems quite interesting what's coming through in that. So if you are interested in a little bit more information or reading on there, I'm sure that'll be pretty easy to find. So that's the Merino Lifetime Productivity Project newsletter. On that
Right.
though,
The latest one, is it?
yes, I believe so, but if anyone wants to correct me, they can. That seems to be all the questions for this evening, unless there are any more late ones come in. All right, thanks everyone for joining us this evening, and thank you very much, Forbes, for running us through the outcomes of the project so far. We look forward to being able to read through the key recommendations in the report. And yeah, there are a few next steps there if anyone is interested in following up. So thanks again, Forbes, and good night, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.